Number 1. Sandy Hook Elementary, Adam Lanza. He barely spoke, avoided eye contact, and spent most of his days hidden away in a darkened bedroom. To neighbors in Newtown, Connecticut, Adam Lanza was just the quiet young man who lived with his mother in a large house on Yogananda Street. No one imagined he would become responsible for one of the deadliest school tragedies in American history. His past hinted at the isolation building inside him. Born in 1992, he was described as an intelligent but socially withdrawn child. In elementary and middle school, he struggled to connect with classmates and often avoided group activities. Teachers recalled that he seemed uncomfortable with touch, sound, and unstructured environments. After his parents divorced in 2009, he grew even more distant. His father remarried and moved away, while his mother, Nancy Lanza, became his primary companion. She homeschooled him, managed his anxiety, and tried to help him navigate everyday life, even as he cut off nearly all outside interaction. By his late teens, he had no job, no college attendance, and no friends visiting the house. His world had shrunk to online forums, violent media, and his mother's gun collection. Nancy was known locally as friendly and sociable, but those close to the family said she struggled to manage Adam's growing detachment. She took him to shooting ranges and legally owned multiple firearms. Investigators later found that he had become obsessed with mass shootings, especially school attacks. He spent hours collecting news articles and researching case timelines. In the months leading up to December 2012, his behavior worsened. He stopped speaking to his mother in person and communicated with her only through notes or written messages left around the house. She continued to care for him, unaware of what he was planning. On the night of December 13th, Adam performed online searches about past shootings and mapped out his final steps. In the early morning of December 14th, while his mother was still asleep, Adam retrieved a rifle and shot her multiple times at close range. She died in bed before she had the chance to react. Taking her car keys, he loaded firearms, ammunition, and magazines into the vehicle and drove to Sandy Hook Elementary School. It was just after 9:30 a.m. when he arrived. The school had recently updated its security procedures, keeping the front doors locked after the morning bell. Adam approached the entrance and used a rifle to shoot through the glass panel beside the door, stepping inside moments later. The sound of gunfire caused confusion among staff. Some thought something had fallen or shattered, not realizing a gunman was already in the hallway. As he moved toward classrooms, teachers shouted for students to hide. Some pulled children into closets and bathrooms, turning off lights and barricading doors. In just a few minutes, he entered 2 first-grade classrooms and continued firing. Calls flooded 911 dispatchers, reporting sounds of shots and screams. Police units were sent immediately, arriving within minutes. Staff members who managed to escape directed officers to the affected rooms. When law enforcement began closing in and the sound of sirens grew louder, Adam entered an empty classroom and ended his own life. From the time he breached the school to the moment he died, less than 11 minutes had passed. Inside the building, investigators found 20 children and 6 adult staff members who had been killed. Many had been trying to shield students or lead them to safety. Survivor accounts describe chaos, confusion, and acts of desperate bravery. News of what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary spread rapidly across the country. Parents rushed to the school, frantically, searching for their children as police set up a staging area. Some were reunited with their kids in tears of relief. Others waited in growing dread as authorities confirmed the number of victims. The scene shocked the nation, leading to international headlines and an outpouring of grief. Vigils were held across multiple states, and the names and photographs of the victims were shared widely. Investigators searched the Lanza home and recovered computers, hard drives, and journals. They discovered Adam had studied previous shooting cases in detail and kept a timeline of incidents. He had shown interest in violent acts but left behind no clear explanation for why he chose Sandy Hook. Because he died at the scene, Adam Lanza never faced charges or a trial. Authorities focused on piecing together his motives and the steps that led to the attack. The FBI and Connecticut State Police spent months analyzing digital evidence, medical records, interviews with family members, and school files. The final report, released in late 2013, concluded that he had significant mental health challenges, but showed no outward warnings in the immediate days before the event. His mother, often described as caring and protective, was criticized posthumously for keeping firearms accessible in the home despite his instability. Some lawmakers proposed new regulations targeting weapon access, school safety standards, and mental health procedures. Since there was no courtroom process, there was no sentence. But the effects of December 14, 2012, reached far beyond Newtown. The event sparked national debates over background checks, assault-style weapons, school resource officers, and emergency response planning. Families of the victims pursued legal action against gun manufacturers and institutions they believed bore responsibility. Education officials across the country re-evaluated campus security measures and crisis drills. Though the reports tried to assemble a full picture of Adam Lanza's life, many questions remained. His father later said he wished his son had never been born, expressing grief over the lives lost and the devastation caused. The Lanza family retreated from public view as media attention focused on the victims and their families. The memory of Sandy Hook continues to influence discussions on public safety and mental health. Communities across the United States reference it when recommending security upgrades, and survivors advocate for supportive services and preventative strategies. Some families of victims have created foundations to honor their children and provide outreach to others affected by trauma. The school building itself was demolished in 2013, and a new facility opened in its place designed with extensive safety features and memorial considerations. Even today, the name Sandy Hook remains a symbol of pain, resilience, and unresolved controversy about how a young man with so many warning signs could carry out something so destructive. When people reflect on Adam Lanza, they often struggle to reconcile his silent existence with the scale of the suffering that followed. He left no manifesto, no recorded demand, no explanation. Instead, investigators found a pattern of isolation, obsession, and gradual withdrawal from reality. The tragedy raised uncomfortable issues about how society identifies risk, supports vulnerable individuals, and manages access to lethal means. The devastation in Newtown forced uncomfortable truths into public conversation, sparking policy shifts and deep mourning. And yet, with all the analysis, there is no simple answer for why it happened in that quiet Connecticut town, or why the signs remained unaddressed until it was too late. Number 2, Robb Elementary School. Salvador Ramos. He spent most of his time alone, drifting between online chats and silent hours in his bedroom, unnoticed by nearly everyone around him. Salvador Ramos was a teenager living in Uvalde, Texas, whose quiet exterior hid growing anger and detachment. Born in 2004, he had a turbulent home life marked by strained family relationships and frequent arguments. Classmates later recalled how he was bullied over his clothes, speech, and social awkwardness. By high school, he rarely attended classes and eventually stopped going altogether. He withdrew further from friends, relatives, and former peers, showing little interest in finishing school or working. Those who knew him described a young man who seemed numb to embarrassment and increasingly consumed by isolation. In the months leading up to the attack, he became more fixated on firearms. Shortly after turning 18 in May 2022, He legally purchased 2 rifles and ammunition from a local gun store. He posted photos of the weapons on social media platforms, but didn't provide any direct threats or warnings that could have triggered the intervention. Around this time, he also engaged in disturbing conversations with online acquaintances, hinting at violence without specific details. Family members noticed mood swings, but believed he was simply frustrated or depressed. Meanwhile, some of his online messaging revealed resentment and fascination with previous mass shootings. None of those exchanges were reported to authorities before the events that would follow. On the morning of May 24, 2022, he argued with his grandmother, with whom he lived. The argument escalated beyond anything she expected. He retrieved one of the rifles and shot her inside the home. Though critically wounded, she managed to call for help and later survived. Salvador took her truck and drove toward Robb Elementary School, located just a few minutes away. As he approached, he crashed the vehicle into a ditch near the campus. Witnesses saw him exit the truck armed and dressed in dark clothing. He fired shots at bystanders outside before heading toward the school building. The time was just before 11:30 a.m. Robb Elementary had a security protocol that involved locked doors and emergency procedures. But one of the doors he approached did not lock properly when shut. He entered through that entrance and stepped into a hallway. Once inside, gunfire echoed through the corridors, sending teachers and students scrambling for cover. Some classrooms managed to lock their doors quickly, forcing him to focus on nearby rooms. He entered adjoining classrooms that shared a connecting door and began shooting, leaving students and teachers trapped with no immediate escape. Calls began flooding emergency dispatch, reporting shots fired and children in danger. Law enforcement officers arrived on scene within minutes, including local police, school district officers, and later state and federal personnel. However, confusion over the chain of command and uncertainty about the situation led to critical delays. Officers gathered in the hallway, but did not immediately breach the classrooms where the gunfire had occurred. Reports and radio conversations from that day showed hesitation, miscommunication, and an assumption that the situation had shifted to a barricaded subject rather than an active shooter. Meanwhile, children trapped inside continued calling 911, whispering for help and pleading as. Minutes dragged on. It took approximately 77 minutes from the time Salvador entered the school until law enforcement breached the classroom. A tactical team eventually arrived, moved down the hallway, and engaged him. He was shot and killed at the scene by officers. The aftermath revealed the devastating toll. 19 children and 2 teachers had been killed, with others injured. The school and the surrounding community were left in shock as parents waited to hear if their children were safe. Medical teams and first responders managed the chaotic aftermath, rushing survivors to hospitals and setting up areas for families to gather. The next hours and days brought national attention. Reporters arrived from across the country, and public officials faced intense scrutiny. Accounts from parents, witnesses, and law enforcement painted a picture of heartbreak and outrage over the response time. Investigations were launched at local, state, and federal levels to determine how the shooter gained access, why protocols failed, and why officers did not act sooner. Authorities examined his digital activity, family history, and psychological state. They found no prior criminal record, no formal mental health diagnosis on record, and no existing protective orders that would have blocked his firearm purchases. Yet they noted patterns of aggression, isolation, and fascination with violence that went unaddressed. Because he was killed at the scene, Salvador Ramos never faced trial or sentencing. Legal focus shifted to accountability for police response, school security measures, and firearm legislation. Families of the victims demanded answers and called for reforms. Some filed lawsuits against agencies or companies connected to the events, citing negligence or failure to protect. State legislators introduced bills calling for changes in emergency response procedures, background checks, and campus safety. The Department of Justice opened a review to evaluate the decisions made by officers and determine how similar tragedies could be prevented. In the months that followed, Robb Elementary School remained closed. Plans were made to demolish the building, with many in the community believing no one should ever be asked to return to the site. Memorials grew outside the school and across town, honoring each victim with photographs, crosses, and messages from around the world. Parents and relatives of the children spoke publicly about their loss, turning grief into advocacy for change. The incident reignited debates over gun laws, school security funding, and mental health services for youth. Law enforcement agencies across the country re-examined protocols to ensure faster intervention in future active shooter situations. Today, the story of Salvador Ramos and Robb Elementary is referenced whenever school safety is discussed in the United States. It exposed gaps in emergency training, communication breakdowns, and the ease with which certain firearms can be obtained. People who once saw him as a quiet, troubled teen now associate his name with one of the deadliest school tragedies ever recorded in Texas. Though investigators pieced together his steps, they could not fully explain the internal motivations behind his actions. The community of Uvalde continues to mourn and rebuild, shaped forever by a day that began like any other and ended as a national reckoning over safety, accountability, and prevention. Number 3, Virginia Tech, Seung-Hui Cho. He blended into the background so completely that most people who passed him hardly remembered his face. Seung-Hui Cho was a student at Virginia Tech, but he rarely spoke in class, avoided eye contact, and isolated himself to an extent that made him almost invisible. Born in South Korea in 1984, he immigrated to the United States with his family as a child. Growing up in Virginia, teachers noticed he struggled with social interaction and verbal communication. By middle school, he was diagnosed with anxiety disorders and selective mutism, and he spent much of his time alone. Despite those challenges, he made it to college and enrolled as an English major. But on campus in Blacksburg, his behavior became more unsettling. Students recalled his silence, refusal to participate, and disturbing pieces of writing that focused on violence and resentment. Some professors and classmates reported their concerns, but no decisive intervention followed. During his time at Virginia Tech, Cho lived in a dormitory and attended classes, but made little connection with anyone. His demeanor set him apart, quiet, detached, and unresponsive to attempts at conversation. In 2005, he was declared mentally ill by a special justice after a psychiatric evaluation, but he was not committed for inpatient treatment. Instead, he was released and told to pursue outpatient care. The lack of follow-up and gaps in communication between departments left his status unclear. Over the next 2 years, his anger and obsession with past gunmen intensified. He wrote violent-themed plays and recorded videos expressing contempt for society and the people he believed had wronged him. Privately, he purchased firearms and ammunition, passing background checks despite his documented mental health ruling because his outpatient status didn't legally disqualify him. On the morning of April 16, 2007, Seung-Hui Cho carried out a plan he had been shaping quietly. Shortly after 7 a.m., he entered West Ambler Johnston Hall, a co-ed dormitory, and shot 2 students, a female resident and a male student who encountered him. He then left the building and returned to his own dorm room. Instead of fleeing, he prepared for the next stage. He mailed a package to a news network that included a manifesto, photographs, and video recordings he had made in the days before. About 2 hours later, he traveled across campus to Norris Hall, an academic building where morning classes were underway. Norris Hall had multiple classrooms and engineering labs. Cho chained several of the building's main doors shut from the inside to prevent escape and delay law enforcement entry. He then moved from room to room, opening fire on students and professors. As shots rang out, frantic calls reached 911 operators. Some classes barricaded doors with desks and lab tables, while others attempted to jump out of windows to escape the gunfire. In several rooms, faculty members tried to shield students or block the doorway, buying precious seconds for others to flee. The hallways filled with sounds of gunfire, screams, and desperate attempts to survive. When police arrived, they faced locked and chained exterior entrances, slowing their initial response. They forced their way in with weapons drawn, moving quickly toward the sounds of gunshots. Inside one of the classrooms, they found Cho had taken his own life as officers approached. In total, he killed 32 people and wounded 17 others, marking it as one of the deadliest campus attacks in U.S. history. The two shootings, first in the dorm and then in Norris Hall, unfolded over approximately 2.5 hours, though the second phase lasted only about 11 minutes once it began. Many of the victims were students attending morning lectures. Professors were killed trying to block doors or protect those inside. The news spread rapidly across the country. That afternoon, Virginia Tech went into lockdown, and emergency alerts were sent to students and parents. Families gathered near campus, waiting for official confirmation about loved ones. Media crews arrived in Blacksburg, turning the area into a focal point for global coverage. The campus community was in shock, holding vigils and memorial gatherings in the days immediately following. The incident raised immediate questions. How did a student with known mental health issues legally obtain firearms? And why were warning signs not addressed more aggressively? The investigation revealed a chain of missed opportunities. Court records showing Cho's mental health ruling had not been added to the national background check system. Faculty concerns about his writing and behavior were noted but not escalated effectively. After the attack, authorities examined his mailed manifesto and footage. In rambling statements, he expressed hatred toward the wealthy, popular, and privileged, framing his actions as revenge. The materials showed a rehearsed bitterness developed over time, though no specific individuals were named as personal targets. Since he died at the scene, there was no trial and no sentencing. Public attention turned toward campus safety, mental health reporting, and firearm access. Schools and universities nationwide reviewed their lockdown procedures and emergency alert systems. Some states strengthened background check laws to ensure mental health adjudications were reported to national databases. Virginia Tech itself established new communication protocols, counseling outreach programs, and physical security upgrades in campus buildings. Families of the victims honored lost loved ones through foundations, scholarships, and memorial events aimed at promoting prevention and support for at-risk students. Norris Hall underwent significant renovations, and some areas were closed off permanently. Plaques and memorials across campus list the names of those who were killed. The annual remembrance events bring together students, alumni, and community members who refuse to let the significance of that day fade. Survivors have shared their stories over the years, describing small decisions that saved their lives and moments of courage amid panic. The memory of what happened there continues to influence training for first responders, counseling services, and law enforcement coordination. In the end, Seung-Hui Cho left behind no courtroom testimony, no cross-examination, and no opportunity for a sentence. The tragedy forced a national conversation about mental health gaps, campus safety, and the responsibility of institutions to act on early signs of danger. Even now, his case is referenced in discussions about privacy laws, background checks, and threat assessment programs. His name remains tied to the lives he cut short and the questions his actions left behind. The effect of that morning at Virginia Tech endures, not just in policy and procedure, but in the stories told by those who lived through it and the memories held by those who lost someone they loved. Number 4, Columbine High School, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. They looked like any other students walking the hallways, but behind closed doors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were building a plan that would shake the entire country. Both were seniors at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. On the surface, they were known as quiet outcasts, not particularly popular, but not entirely unnoticed. Eric had a history of trouble with anger and control, while Dylan struggled with depression and a growing sense of detachment. In 1998, the two were arrested for breaking into a van and were ordered to attend a juvenile diversion program. They completed it and appeared to move on, but privately, their resentment festered. Throughout their final year of high school, their behavior showed subtle signs of escalating hostility. They recorded videos together, venting about classmates and society. They wrote journals filled with anger, revenge fantasies, and admiration for previous attackers. They also documented the early stages of what would become a calculated plan for mass violence. They began acquiring firearms through private sellers and friends, avoiding background checks that would have flagged their age. They also gathered materials to create homemade explosives. Their goal wasn't limited to shooting. They intended to surpass any previous incident in scale and impact. On the morning of April the 20th, 1999, they arrived at Columbine wearing long coats to conceal their weapons. They carried shotguns, a carbine rifle, and a Tech 9 style pistol. They placed duffel bags containing propane bombs in the school cafeteria, timed to detonate during the busiest lunch period. When the bombs failed to go off, they moved to their backup plan. At approximately 11:19 a.m., they began shooting outside near the west entrance, targeting students who were eating and talking outdoors. Panicked calls flooded emergency lines, and the school went into lockdown as teachers shouted for students to take cover. Eric and Dylan entered the building and headed toward the library, where many students had fled to hide. For several minutes, they moved through the room, firing at anyone they encountered. Some students were injured while trying to hide under tables. Others managed to escape through windows. Their movements were chaotic but deliberate, and they showed no intention of surrendering. In the library alone, they killed multiple students and injured many more within a short time span. They also attempted to locate police officers through gunfire exchanges from windows. The level of fear and confusion inside the school made it difficult for law enforcement to understand what was happening in real time. Meanwhile, explosive devices they had scattered around the school and in their cars failed to detonate properly, preventing even greater destruction. Police and SWAT teams surrounded the campus and worked to evacuate students and staff. Some teachers and students were trapped for hours, hiding in classrooms and closets, unsure if the attackers were still nearby. Inside the library, after nearly 50 minutes of violence, Eric and Dylan turned their weapons on themselves. By the time they died, 12 students and 1 teacher had been killed, and over 20 others were wounded. The shock extended beyond the building, as parents and media gathered outside waiting for updates, many unaware whether their children were alive. In the days that followed, investigators searched their homes and computers. They found videotapes the pair had recorded beforehand, explaining their intentions and showcasing their resentment. Their journals detailed months of planning, including the failed bomb strategy. Friends and acquaintances were questioned, and some admitted they had seen changes in their behavior, but didn't foresee the scale of what they had planned. Questions arose about how they obtained their weapons and why warning signs went unreported or overlooked. The combination of depression, anger, and desire for notoriety created a deadly outcome that few believed possible at the time. Because both shooters died at the scene, there was no trial. The legal focus shifted to the families of victims, school officials, local police, and firearms sellers. Lawsuits were filed, committees were formed, and national conversations about bullying, school safety, and mental health intensified. The attack exposed gaps in emergency response protocols and communication systems between schools and law enforcement. Columbine became a reference point for future active shooter training, lockdown drills, and the introduction of school resource officers across the country. The event marked a turning point in how schools prepare for threats and how lawmakers address access to firearms. In the years after the attack, detailed investigative reports revealed the full extent of the preparations Eric and Dylan had made. They built bombs, documented their frustrations, and set a date months in advance. They aimed to create mass casualties far beyond what ultimately occurred. Multiple federal and state agencies examined the case to understand the breakdowns in threat assessment. Families of victims created foundations and scholarships in memory of loved ones. Survivors shared their experiences to advocate for prevention, mental health awareness, and changes in school policy. The legacy of Columbine is heavy and complex. It influenced security measures across the United States and reshaped how people think about threats in places once considered safe. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold left behind no courtroom testimony and no chance for cross-examination, but their actions sparked decades of reform, analysis, and grief. Even now, the name Columbine carries a weight that signals pain, prevention efforts, and continued vigilance. Each year, the victims are remembered by family, friends, and those who survived, ensuring the conversation does not fade. The story of what happened on that April morning continues to serve as a reminder of how isolation, planning, and overlooked warning signs can lead to irreversible tragedy. Number 5. Parkland. Stoneman Douglas. Nicholas Cruz. He was a former student no one expected to return, especially not with the kind of intent he carried. Nicholas Cruz had once walked the halls of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, as a troubled teenager with a track record of behavioral issues. Born in 1998 and adopted as an infant, he grew up in a household where his parents tried to manage his outbursts and emotional struggles. His adoptive father died when he was still young, and his mother faced increasing difficulties controlling his aggression and impulsive actions. Teachers and administrators had documented years of concerning behavior, fights, threats, fixation on weapons, and repeated disciplinary problems. Eventually, he was removed from the school and placed in an alternative program due to multiple violations. Despite all the documented issues, there were no long-term restrictions that blocked him from legally obtaining firearms once he reached adulthood. After his mother died suddenly in November 2017, he moved in with family friends, and later with a schoolmate's family under certain conditions. Around this time, he purchased an AR-15 style rifle and ammunition, fueling concerns among those who knew his past. Some people reported alarming social media posts he made about wanting to carry out a shooting, but the warnings were scattered and didn't lead to preventive action. Law enforcement and school officials had contact with him on multiple occasions before the attack, yet none of those interventions halted what he was planning. On February 14th, 2018, Cruz took an Uber to his former high school. He carried a duffel bag and a rifle case, but drew little attention as he entered the building near dismissal time. Once inside, he assembled the firearm and activated the school's fire alarm system to force students and staff out of classrooms. As the hallways filled, he began firing at close range, moving through the first and second floors of Building 12. Students scrambled for cover, hiding in classrooms, closets, or behind desks. Some teachers tried to shield them, while others locked doors and turned off lights. Several students recorded the chaos on their phones as gunshots echoed across the campus. Law enforcement received multiple 911 calls within minutes. Officers from local agencies and the county sheriff's office arrived quickly, but confusion over the exact location delayed their approach. Cruz continued moving through the building, targeting classrooms and hallways, until he discarded his weapon and blended in with fleeing students. He exited the school grounds on foot and headed into a nearby residential area. He entered a Subway restaurant to buy a drink, and then visited a McDonald's, walking among people who had no idea who he was. It took about an hour for officers to locate and arrest him without resistance. 17 people were killed that day, 14 students and 3 staff members, and 17 more were wounded. The scale of the violence stunned the nation, particularly because the attack occurred in broad daylight at a large suburban school with recent security updates. In the hours after his arrest, Nicholas Cruz confessed to carrying out the shooting. Investigators found online messages, videos, and journal entries showing his interest in previous mass shootings and his desire to cause large-scale harm. He spoke of wanting to inspire fear and draw attention to himself. The legal process was lengthy and highly publicized. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the number of victims and the premeditated nature of the attack. His defense team argued that he had a history of emotional and developmental challenges, behavioral disorders, and a lack of consistent treatment. In 2021, Cruz changed his plea to guilty on all counts: 17 charges of killing and 17 charges of attempted killing. The case then moved into a penalty phase to determine whether he would face death or life in prison without parole. The proceedings involved emotional testimony from survivors, teachers, and family members of victims. Prosecutors presented evidence of planning, statements he made beforehand, and the extent of the casualties. The defense focused on his upbringing, mental health issues, and his mother's death, claiming he was a broken individual long before the attack. After weeks of testimony, the jury did not reach a unanimous decision for the death penalty. As a result, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole in late 2022. Many families expressed anger and disappointment at the outcome, believing the severity of the crime warranted capital punishment. Nicholas Cruz is now held in a maximum security facility, spending his life behind bars. The impact of his actions, however, extended far beyond his sentence. Students who survived the shooting became vocal advocates for change, leading national protests and campaigns to reform firearm laws and emergency protocols in schools. The event led to investigations into law enforcement responses, school security policies, and mental health services. Florida legislators passed new measures, including a red flag law, allowing the temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed a threat. The name Parkland became synonymous with activism, grief, and calls for accountability. The families of the victims continued to push for reforms, meeting with lawmakers and sharing their stories publicly. Marjorie Stoneman, Douglas High School increased security and counseling resources, and the building where the shooting took place was slated for demolition. The emotional scars left by that day remain with those who were inside the school and the broader community that witnessed the aftermath. Nicholas Cruz's path from troubled student to convicted mass killer exposed deep failures in prevention, reporting, and support systems. His actions sparked a national reckoning over safety in schools, the responsibilities of institutions, and the warning signs that too often go overlooked. Today, people remember not just the violence he committed, but the voices of the survivors and families who turned their pain into a force for change. Number 6. Aurora Theater. James Holmes. He walked into the midnight premiere like any other moviegoer, but what he carried with him would turn a night of entertainment into one of the darkest tragedies in modern U.S. history. James Holmes grew up in California, described by many who knew him as quiet, intelligent, and socially awkward. Born in 1987, he excelled academically and showed early interest in neuroscience. After graduating from the University of California, Riverside with honors, he was accepted into a competitive neuroscience PhD program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora. But as his academic challenges increased, so did his internal unraveling. Classmates and faculty began noticing changes. He grew withdrawn, stopped participating in group projects, and struggled to keep up with coursework. By the spring of 2012, his grades had slipped and he failed an important oral exam, leading him to drop out of the program. Behind the scenes, Holmes was battling significant mental health problems. In March 2012, he began seeing a campus psychiatrist and spoke briefly about violent thoughts and fantasies. The psychiatrist shared concerns with the university's threat assessment team, but because he was withdrawing from school and hadn't made direct threats, no further action was taken. Around the same time, he legally purchased multiple firearms from local gun stores, a shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and a handgun, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition online. He also ordered tactical gear, including a helmet, vest, and gas mask. Neighbors saw boxes being delivered to his apartment, but had no idea of his intentions. While preparing for the attack, he booby-trapped his apartment with homemade explosives and tripwires designed to detonate if someone opened the door. On July 19, 2012, he mailed a notebook to his former psychiatrist containing violent writings, but it wasn't opened until after everything unfolded. The next night, July 20th, he drove to the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, where hundreds of people had gathered for the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. He bought a ticket, entered the auditorium, and sat in the front row for a few minutes before leaving through an emergency exit he propped open. Shortly after 12:30 a.m., he returned through that same side door wearing body armor and carrying weapons. Without saying anything, he threw gas canisters into the crowd. As the smoke spread, moviegoers initially thought it was part of a stunt related to the film. Moments later, he began firing into the audience, moving slowly and targeting anyone in range. Panic erupted as people dove behind seats, crawled along aisles, or tried to escape up the stairs. Some made it out through emergency exits, while others were trapped in the chaos and confusion. Within minutes, dozens had been shot. Outside, calls to 911 flooded dispatchers, and officers from multiple agencies rushed to the scene. Police arrived within minutes, encountering wounded victims fleeing the building and others motionless inside. In the parking lot, James Holmes was found standing near his car. He offered no resistance when officers approached, and he identified himself immediately. He was wearing tactical gear and had weapons still in the vehicle. At the scene, he warned officers that his apartment was rigged with explosives. Bomb squads were deployed to disarm the devices before anyone could enter. Inside the theater, 12 people were killed and 70 others were injured by gunfire, many of them critically. Survivors described scenes of confusion and terror, stumbling over bodies, slipping on blood, and hearing non-stop shots in the darkness. Emergency responders established triage areas outside the theater, using police cars to transport victims because ambulances were overwhelmed. The attack became one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history at the time. News coverage spread nationwide by sunrise, and the names of victims and survivors began to surface throughout the day. James Holmes was taken into custody and later charged with 166 counts, including killing and attempted killing. His legal team pursued an insanity defense, arguing that his mental illness distorted his perception of reality and his ability to control his actions. Prosecutors countered that the level of planning demonstrated he knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to the firearms purchases, the booby-trapped apartment, and the timing of the attack as evidence of intent. Survivors and family members of the victims packed court hearings over the following months, many urging the harshest possible sentence. During the trial, testimony from psychiatrists was central. 2 court-appointed experts examined Holmes and concluded he was mentally ill but not legally insane by the standards required to avoid criminal responsibility. The prosecution described the attack step by step, showing evidence of his preparations and the devastating impact on the victims. Family members shared statements about lives cut short, permanent injuries, and trauma that would never fade. The defense emphasized his long decline, his failed academic journey, and the warning signs that had been missed. After a months-long trial in 2015, the jury found Holmes guilty on all counts. In the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, but the decision required unanimity. Ultimately, at least one juror refused to approve execution, and the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a high-security prison and remains there under close supervision. Some victims' families expressed frustration at the lack of a death sentence, while others said life behind bars was a just outcome. The aftermath of the Aurora Theater attack led to extensive policy discussions about background checks, mental health reporting, emergency response systems, and theater security. The movie theater eventually reopened after renovations, but the auditorium where the shooting occurred was permanently closed and redesigned. Memorials were created to honor those who died, and scholarships and charities were established in their names. Survivors faced years of recovery, surgeries, and emotional wounds that continued long after the headlines faded. James Holmes never offered a clear explanation for his actions, and his motive remains a subject of analysis and speculation. Investigators pointed to a combination of isolation, untreated mental illness, academic failure, and fascination with notoriety. What is certain is that his attack changed how people think about safety in public spaces and how institutions handle individuals in crisis. The events of that night in Aurora left a legacy of grief, legal reform efforts, and unanswered questions about what could have stopped him before he stepped into that theater. Number 7. Cleveland Elementary School. Patrick Purdy. He arrived at the schoolyard in the middle of a clear January morning, blending in just long enough before everything changed. Patrick Purdy was a drifter with a long history of instability, minor arrests, and resentment towards society. Born in 1964, he grew up in a troubled home in California, marked by frequent moves, an abusive father, and a childhood spent bouncing between relatives and foster care. As he got older, he struggled with substance abuse and unemployment. Those who encountered him as an adult described him as angry, directionless, and obsessed with the idea that the world had robbed him of opportunity. His arrests included possession charges, vandalism, and weapons violations. Each time, he slipped through the system without long-term supervision or intervention. By the late 1980s, Purdy had developed a fixation on blaming immigrants and minorities for his personal failures. He spent time living in board and care homes and worked various low-wage jobs when he could stay employed. In the months leading up to the attack, he purchased firearms legally, including a semi-automatic rifle. Despite his criminal history and documented mental decline, background check systems at the time were limited and failed to stop the sale. He also modified the weapon to make it even more dangerous. People who saw him said he often muttered to himself and seemed increasingly detached from reality. On January 17, 1989, Patrick Purdy drove to Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California. The school served a large population of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugee children who had fled war and resettled in the area with their families. Purdy parked his car behind the building and set it on fire using a gasoline-filled container, possibly to create confusion or block escape routes. He then walked onto the school playground, carrying a semi-automatic rifle and extra ammunition. Without warning, he opened fire on a crowd of young students who were outside for their morning break. Witnesses later said he appeared deliberate and emotionless, aiming directly into the group while children screamed and tried to run. Teachers and staff rushed to pull students inside classrooms. Some shielded children with their bodies, while others locked doors and called for help. Within minutes, calls to police and emergency responders described dozens of wounded children and chaos on the school grounds. Purdy continued firing until his weapon jammed and he realized officers were closing in. He then ended his own life at the scene with a handgun he carried. The entire attack lasted only a few minutes, but left devastation that would be felt across the nation. 5 children were killed, all of them between 6 and 9 years old, and around 30 others were injured, mostly by gunfire. The victims were primarily students from Southeast Asian refugee families. Survivors recalled the confusion and terror of watching friends collapse beside them. Police and paramedics flooded the area, rushing wounded children to nearby hospitals. Parents arrived at the school desperately searching for their sons and daughters, some finding them alive, others forced to face unthinkable news. The investigation into Patrick Purdy's life revealed a history of neglect, prejudice, and mental instability. He had expressed hatred toward immigrants and blamed them for taking jobs and resources. In his car and rented room, authorities found racist writings and items indicating his violent ideologies. His movements in the weeks before the attack suggested he had chosen the school intentionally because of the large population of immigrant children. He had no specific personal connection to the victims or staff, making the violence even more senseless in the eyes of the community. Because he died at the scene, there was no trial or sentencing. Legal and political attention turned instead to how he obtained the weapon and what laws needed to change. Lawmakers in California responded quickly, passing new restrictions on semi-automatic rifles and magazine capacities. The incident helped shape the national dialogue on gun control in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Advocacy groups and families of victims pushed for stricter background checks and mental health evaluations for firearm purchases. The federal government later used the attack as a case study when drafting broader legislation. Cleveland Elementary School struggled to move forward in the aftermath. Counseling services were provided to students and staff, many of whom suffered from long-term trauma. The playground where the attack occurred was renovated, and memorials were created to honor the children who were killed. Community members came together to support the families, many of whom had already endured war and displacement, only to face tragedy in what was supposed to be a place of safety. In the years that followed, the Stockton shooting was referenced frequently whenever school safety was discussed in America. It demonstrated how quickly a single individual with a powerful weapon could shatter a community. Experts and lawmakers began advocating for threat assessment programs, firearm restrictions, and better intervention for individuals with violent ideation. While later tragedies would overshadow its name, the Cleveland Elementary attack marked a turning point in how schools and law enforcement prepared for mass shootings. Patrick Purdy left behind no courtroom testimony and no chance for cross-examination. His actions were driven by a mix of hatred, instability, and a desire to lash out at those he blamed for his own failures. The tragedy he caused lives on in the memories of survivors and the families of the children who never came home. His name is now tied to a moment in history that forced painful questions about access to weapons, overlooked warning signs, and the vulnerability of innocent lives in everyday environments. Number 8. West Side Middle School. Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson. They were just 11 and 13 years old, too young for most people to imagine capable of planning anything beyond typical childhood mischief. But Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson turned their Arkansas school into the scene of a carefully coordinated attack that stunned the nation. Mitchell, the older of the two, had already begun showing signs of anger and defiance by his early teens. He had spoken about wanting to hurt people and made threats that some classmates brushed off as tough talk. Andrew, despite being only 11, was described as quiet but unnervingly comfortable around firearms. He came from a family that owned several guns, and he learned to shoot at a young age. Together, they formed a bond fueled by resentment and curiosity about violence. In the months before the attack, they talked about carrying out something that would make people remember them. They began stealing weapons from Andrew's grandfather, including rifles, handguns, and ammunition. They also took camping gear and supplies, showing they were thinking beyond the act itself. Friends recalled them bragging that something big was coming, but no one believed two boys that young would act on such words. There were warning signs at school, arguments, threats, and troubling comments, but their ages made it difficult for anyone to take the threats seriously. On March 24th, 1998, the boys followed through. That morning, they loaded the stolen weapons and supplies into Mitchell's mother's van and drove to West Side Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Once there, Andrew went inside the school and pulled the fire alarm. As students and teachers began evacuating, thinking it was a normal drill, the two positioned themselves in a wooded area overlooking the schoolyard. From that vantage point, they opened fire as their classmates and teachers filed outside in lines. The attack lasted only minutes, but it felt far longer to those trying to escape the gunfire. Panic erupted as children ran in every direction, searching for cover with no idea where the shots were coming from. Teachers tried to shield students or lead them back into the building. Emergency calls went out immediately, but by the time officers arrived, the shooting had stopped. The boys had dropped their weapons and attempted to flee on foot, but police captured them nearby. Investigators were stunned to see the ages of the suspects. The scale of the violence made it difficult to reconcile the shooters with the children standing in handcuffs. 5 people were killed, 4 students and 1 teacher, and 10 others were injured. The victims were caught in the confusion of the evacuation, unaware they were walking into an ambush. In the aftermath, the small town of Jonesboro was left in shock. Families gathered at hospitals and reunification centers, hoping their children were safe. The crime scene stretched from the schoolyard to the wooded area where the boys had lain in wait. Authorities recovered multiple weapons, ammunition, and bags packed with food and clothing, indicating they had planned to escape and survive on the run after the attack. Because of their ages, the legal system faced limits in how they could be prosecuted. At the time, Arkansas law did not allow minors as young as Mitchell and Andrew to be tried as adults for killing. Both were charged as juveniles, and the maximum sentence they could receive was confinement until age 21. They were found guilty of killing and injuring their classmates and teacher, and they were sent to separate juvenile detention facilities. Their seemingly short sentences outraged many in the community and across the country, sparking debate about laws for juvenile offenders who commit mass violence. some lawmakers pushed to change sentencing rules so young perpetrators of serious crimes could be held longer. As their release dates approached, concern grew about what would happen once they were free. Mitchell Johnson was released in 2005 at age 21, and Andrew Golden followed 2 years later when he reached the same age. Neither could be monitored in the same way adult felons would have been, and their juvenile records were sealed. Years later, Johnson would face new legal trouble for firearm possession and drug charges, showing that his violence at 13 had not been a one-time act. Golden lived quietly under a different name until his death in a car crash in 2019. The West Side Middle School shooting became one of the earliest and most shocking examples of youth-led mass violence in the United States. It forced changes in juvenile justice laws across multiple states and encouraged schools to rethink lockdown procedures and alarm responses. The fire alarm strategy showed a calculated understanding of how the school functioned during emergencies, and educational institutions nationwide took notice. For the families of the victims, the scars never faded. Memorials were built to honor those who were taken, and survivors spoke about the long-term impact, nightmares, anxiety, and the loss of a sense of safety in what should have been an ordinary school day. The event also helped shape future discussions about access to firearms in homes with children. Andrew had easy access to his family's guns, and Mitchell had no trouble helping transport them. Their youth did not stop them from planning, stealing, and executing their attack with precision rare for their ages. Even decades later, the case stands out for its combination of youth, planning, and lethality. The story of Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson is a reminder that danger can come from places most people never consider. Their actions changed laws, reshaped safety protocols, and left a legacy of grief that still echoes through the community they targeted. Number 9. Pulse nightclub. Omar Mateen. He walked in just after last call, blending with the late-night crowd before revealing the purpose that brought him there. Omar Mateen was born in New York in 1986 to Afghan immigrant parents and raised in Florida. As a child, he was described as temperamental and easily provoked. Teachers noticed aggressive behavior early on, and classmates recalled him lashing out or making disturbing comments. As he grew older, the anger never quite faded. He briefly attended a community college criminal justice program, but never finished. He worked as a security guard for years, moving from one post to another with complaints from coworkers about hostility, prejudice, and erratic behavior. Mateen married twice, and both relationships reflected turbulence. His first wife later said he was controlling and abusive, prone to sudden fits of rage. After their divorce, he remarried and maintained a distant but seemingly stable life with his second wife, who would later claim she saw warning signs but didn't know how to intervene. Over time, he began showing interest in extremist ideologies, browsing violent content online, and voicing admiration for attackers overseas. The FBI interviewed him twice, once after he made concerning comments about extremism, and once due to possible links to a former acquaintance tied to terrorism. Both investigations were closed when agents found no active threat and no direct evidence of criminal planning. He legally purchased firearms and ammunition in the weeks leading up to the attack. His behavior at the gun store drew little attention. He passed background checks without issue. Meanwhile, he visited Pulse nightclub in Orlando on multiple occasions before the night of the attack, possibly to scout the location. The nightclub was known as a popular gathering spot for the LGBTQ+ community, especially on its Latin-themed nights. Mateen entered just after 2 a.m. on June 12, 2016, carrying a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. Moments later, he opened fire on the crowd inside. Music still played as people tried to make sense of the noise, only to realize too late what was happening. Panic swept through the building as patrons rushed to escape through emergency exits, bathrooms, and back hallways. Some hid wherever they could, trapped as shots echoed through the club. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to survival within seconds. Mateen moved through the main area, firing at anyone in sight. Survivors described glass shattering, bodies falling, and screams drowned out by gunfire. Police arrived quickly and engaged Mateen from outside, forcing him deeper into the building. He retreated into a bathroom area where dozens of people had taken cover. There, he held survivors hostage while officers secured the perimeter and attempted communication. During the standoff, Mateen called 911 and pledged allegiance to extremist groups, though investigators later concluded his ideological claims were inconsistent and self-directed rather than part of any organized plot. Negotiators spoke with him multiple times, trying to gather information and stall further violence. Hours passed while wounded victims lay on the floor, some texting loved ones and emergency services for help. At approximately 5 a.m., after hearing shots from inside and fearing imminent loss of life, SWAT officers breached the building by driving through a wall with an armored vehicle and using explosives to disorient Mateen. A gunfight followed, and officers killed him in the exchange. Inside, the scale of the attack became clear. 49 people were killed, and more than 50 others were wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting in the U.S. at that time. First responders worked through the dawn, transporting survivors to hospitals and helping families locate loved ones. As details emerged, vigils began forming across Orlando and around the country. The crime scene extended across multiple rooms and exit points, with personal belongings and shattered furniture scattered across the floor. Investigators searched Mateen's home, electronic devices, and financial records. They found no evidence of accomplices or foreign directives, concluding that he acted alone, fueled by personal anger, extremist rhetoric, and a desire for infamy. Since Mateen died in the shootout, there was no trial. However, his actions led to legal proceedings involving his wife, who was charged with aiding the attack and obstructing justice. After a lengthy trial, she was acquitted, with jurors concluding prosecutors had not proven she knew his plan or helped him. The focus then shifted to accountability in other areas, specifically how someone with Mateen's background and FBI contacts could still legally arm himself. The aftermath of the attack reshaped conversations about hate crimes, mass shootings, and emergency response tactics. Pulse nightclub became a memorial site, and plans were made to preserve part of the building as a remembrance. The victims' names were read aloud at public ceremonies, and murals went up across Orlando honoring the lost. Advocacy groups called for stronger gun legislation, better tracking of domestic threats, and increased support for affected communities. Investigators determined that Mateen's motivations were layered: personal humiliation, ideological fixation, and frustration he carried silently for years. His actions left behind grieving families, wounded survivors, and a city forced to confront the consequences of overlooked warning signs. The Pulse nightclub shooting became a symbol of resilience and remembrance, with annual observances held to honor the victims. Even now, the attack is referenced in discussions about prevention, law enforcement coordination, and the deadly impact a single individual can have in minutes. Number 10, Oikos University, 1L Go. He arrived on campus carrying the weight of resentment that had been building for years. 1L Go, a former nursing student at Oikos University in Oakland, California, once came to the small private school hoping to restart his life. Born in South Korea in 1968, he immigrated to the United States as an adult and spent years moving between jobs and struggling to find stability. He enlisted in the military at one point, but received an administrative discharge. Friends and relatives described him as quiet and withdrawn, often uncomfortable socially, and prone to frustration when things didn't go his way. Over time, he fell deeper into isolation and disappointment. In 2011, Go enrolled at Oikos University, a Christian vocational college offering programs in nursing and ministry. He clashed with classmates and instructors, reportedly angry about perceived disrespect and his difficulty keeping up with coursework. His English skills were limited, and he often felt mocked or ignored. Instructors said he showed signs of anger and paranoia, but there was no incident severe enough to remove him immediately. Eventually, he stopped attending classes and withdrew from the program. He believed the school owed him tuition refunds and blamed both students and staff for humiliating him. Financial struggles and mounting bitterness consumed much of his life after leaving the school. In the months leading up to the attack, Go's behavior became more erratic. He moved out of state temporarily and cut ties with most people he knew. When he returned to California, he appeared to be carrying unresolved anger about his time at Oikos. On April 2nd, 2012, he made the decision to confront the school in the most violent way possible. That morning, he traveled to the campus armed with a handgun and extra ammunition. He entered the building and approached a receptionist, directing her at gunpoint to get students into a classroom. When she couldn't comply, he began shooting without hesitation. Inside one of the classrooms, students tried to hide under desks or escape through doors and windows. Go moved from person to person, targeting individuals at close range. Witnesses later said he appeared calm and methodical. Some students fled the building and alerted others, while calls to 911 poured in. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallways, and people in adjacent rooms locked themselves in place to keep the shooter out. The attack lasted only minutes, but the devastation was immediate and widespread. By the time he walked out of the building and fled the scene in a former classmate's car, 7 people were dead and 3 others were injured. The victims included students and staff members, several of whom were immigrants pursuing new careers. Law enforcement launched a manhunt that ended about an hour later, when Go surrendered at a grocery store in a nearby city. He told employees there that he had just shot people and needed to speak with police. Officers arrested him without incident. In custody, Go spoke about feeling disrespected and ridiculed by students and instructors at Oikos University. He claimed people had teased him about his accent and intelligence, and he believed the school had cheated him financially. Investigators retrieved the firearm he used and traced how he acquired it legally months before. Interviews with former classmates confirmed tensions between him and others, though no one imagined he would return with such violent intent. Many of his grievances appeared exaggerated or unfounded, but his fixation on them had become all-consuming. Go was charged with 7 counts of killing and 3 counts of attempted killing. His legal proceedings were shaped by questions about his competency to stand trial. Psychiatrists evaluated him multiple times, citing symptoms of schizophrenia and paranoia. For months, court hearings were delayed as judges reviewed his mental state and capacity to understand the charges. In 2013, he was ruled incompetent and sent to a state hospital for treatment. After nearly 2 years, doctors declared him competent enough to proceed. In 2017, Go entered a plea of no contest to all charges to avoid a trial. Prosecutors and the court accepted the plea agreement, and he was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the attempted killings. Families of the victims spoke in court about the lives cut short. Individuals who had come from other countries seeking education, better opportunities, and refugee from hardship. Some relatives expressed relief that he would never be released, while others said no sentence could balance the loss they suffered. Oikos University never fully returned to its previous operation. Enrollment dropped sharply, and many students transferred or left the area altogether. The building where the shooting took place was eventually closed, and efforts were made to remember the victims through memorial services and plaques. The attack brought national attention to issues of campus safety, mental health, and the vulnerabilities of small schools not equipped to handle security threats. One Elgo now lives out his life in prison, largely removed from the world he once blamed for his failures. His story is a painful example of how unresolved anger, untreated mental illness, and easy access to firearms can lead to sudden and catastrophic violence. The Oikos University shooting remains one of the deadliest attacks on a school in California's history, and a reminder that danger can come from those who once walked the same hallways without drawing notice.